Speaking of popes, we'd like to go back to looking at a couple of specific texts, and I think we want to use them to illustrate what we talked about in the last segment. That is to say, you need to get a few of the footnotes right, you need to read a few of the footnotes, but also these texts have a power not just in Dante's own time, explicating either his poetic genius or ideas in medieval society, but also are really important concerns that we have in our own day. And what better place to start than one of the best known of all the cantos, Inferno 19, where we're going to meet some upside down and not very happy popes.
The sin, of course, is the sin of simony. The technical name for simony, or the technical definition, is the buying and selling of church offices. But for Dante, it means something much larger and more comprehensive. It means any way in which the spiritual is turned into the material. And what you see here are the most egregious examples of simoniacs, but at a later point in the comedy, in Purgatorio, one of the things that we find out is that Dante believes that the greatest source of evil in his own day is bad leadership, and in particular bad spiritual leadership. So that, in a way, by showing us what life is like at the top of the food chain with corrupt popes, he's suggesting that, I don't know if he believes in trickle-down economics, but he does believe in trickle-down evil. That is to say, it is much more difficult, it is difficult to live the moral life to the degree that it's corrupt from the top. And to illustrate that, of course, is the story of the simoniac popes who are presented here. They're presented by being followers of that great, wonderful character, Simon the Magician, who first shows up in Acts of the Apostles trying to buy the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Peter justly rebukes him, tells him to take his money and go to hell. The interesting thing about Simon is that the story didn't really stop there. There was a kind of continuation of the legend beyond Scripture to some of the apocryphal sources, in particular a wonderful work called the Acts of Peter, where Simon the Magician goes to Egypt, learns a little bit of black magic, comes back, challenges Peter to a kind of shootout at the OK Corral, the OK Corral here being Rome. Simon leaps off of the gates of Rome, starts flying around, and says, "Top that one." Peter gets down on his knees and he says, "Lord, if this continues, a lot of people are going to be turned away from you." So Simon does this wonderful nosedive and gets buried headfirst in the ground with his legs flapping in the air. The fall of Simon the Magician, as it's called, the fall of Simon Magus, becomes a kind of neat image, a kind of banner for church reform starting in the 12th century. Bill and I don't want to brag about our great history as publishers together, but we actually did an article on Simon the Magician that was published, are you ready for this, in the Journal of Magic History. It turns out it was right next to a card trick and something about some Dickens novel that had a conjurer in it, and something about an educated pig, as I recall.
In
the same volume.
Has variety.
And with pictures too. And so one of the things that we learned from researching the pictorial tradition is that there are a huge number of depictions of the fall of Simon the Magician, very often presented in pictorial histories of the life of St. Peter, so that as Simon Peter represents the model of the papacy, Simon the Magician represents the model of the papacy gone bad. And that inversion, notice it's Simon and Simon, so to speak, that inversion is really what structures the entire canto here, because, of course, these people are mirrors of that idea of apostolic succession, which Dante took very, very seriously, except these are successors in simony. And just as there can only be one pope occupying the chair of Peter, the cathedra Petri, at the same time, there's only one pope occupying the infernal, simoniac, parodic chair, because each new one is going to sort of push his predecessor further down into the stone. So with that ingenious mechanism, Dante creates a story about the fate of the fate of money grubbing in the church.
O Simon Magus, O scum that followed him, those things of God that rightly should be wed to holiness, you, rapacious creatures, for the price of gold and silver, prostitute. Now, in your honor, I must sound my trumpet, for here in the third pouch is where you dwell. Those are the first 6 lines of Canto 19 of Inferno. They are, of course, the words of Dante the poet. They're not part of a conversation, because Dante the pilgrim doesn't know where he is yet. He's going to be all confused as he usually is. This is Dante the poet, in a sense, saying to us, the readers, pay attention.
This is going to be a big one.
This is a biggie.
Yeah.
Secondly, in those 6 lines, he twice cites words, phrases, names from the Acts of the Apostles. Because if you're going to talk about how the church is supposed to be, you go back to the beginning. And of course, the birthday of the church is described, and the early years of the church are described in the Acts of the Apostles. Simon Magus, as Ron pointed out, in Acts of the Apostles 8, and referring to the price of gold and silver, well, in Acts of the Apostles chapter 3, when somebody comes up to Peter and says, hey, give me some money, Peter's response is, gold and silver I have none, but what I have I give you. So that already, twice in the first 6 lines, we are being told that we're going to see Dante using the earliest church, as it's described in Acts of the Apostles, as his model, and therefore don't be surprised that the birthday event of the church, that is to say Pentecost, is in a sense going to be turned, not in a sense, literally going to be turned upside down in what follows in Inferno 19.
It's kind of neat apocryphal story about, I think it's told about Thomas Aquinas, who is being given a tour of the papal apartments, and the Pope says sort of modestly, you can see I can no longer say silver and gold I have none, and Thomas's reply is, no, and neither can you say take up your pallet and walk.
Where does that story come from? I've heard it before.
You mean the one about Aquinas? The one that I just mentioned about Aquinas? I don't have a site right here. I can get back to you when I look it up. I've heard it told variously, and I have a terrible suspicion that the place that I got it from was a Dante commentary. I wouldn't be surprised if I got it from the Singleton commentary, but I'll have to check that one out.
So after this sort of initial, actually there are 2 separate statements here at the beginning, because line 10 begins, oh, highest wisdom, and so on. We have this great sort of prophetic tone to this canto. And then Dante falls back into the narrative. I was walking along, here's what I saw, and of course what he saw, and if you have the Musa translation, there's a diagram of things. You go down this ditch, okay? So the word bulge, there are 10 ditches in this part of hell. You go down the ditch, and there are these holes in the stone, and they're and all along the way. And Dante, as he often does, Dante the poet, says to his readers, let me tell you what this sort of reminds me of back on earth. So you've got some visual image. And what it reminds me of is the way of the setup of the baptistry in Florence, what he calls Mi Bel San Giovanni. And we need to appreciate how this works, because that font is no longer there. There are similar ones. How many of you have been to either the baptistry in Pisa, or less likely the baptistry in Pistoia? Have you been to? Okay. If you know the baptistry in Pisa, you know what the one in Florence looked like. Okay? It was sort of hexagonal, and at each one of the angles there was a stone tube. Okay? And then inside there's water. So there's this sort of big round thing, roundish thing. And what would happen is that baptism was a communal event, and especially in Florence, because Florence is patron saint of John Baptist. And so on June 24th, you would, unless there was fear of death, before that, you'd bring your baby to Mi Bel San Giovanni for baptism. And it was sort of a continuous all-day activity. It was a communal thing. And you would bring a baby, and you would hand it to a priest in one of these stone holes, keep them dry, and he would turn around and he would baptize the baby in the water, turn around, give the baby back, and do the next baby. A lot of babies born in Florence in a year. Okay? Florence had a population of 100,000 people.
Yeah.
So this is the way it worked. And Dante says, well, what we see down here in hell sort of reminds me of those stone tubes, sort of waist-high stone tubes in the baptismal font of San Giovanni, my beautiful San Giovanni, where, of course, Dante himself had been baptized, presumably the year he was born, in 1265. And then Dante says, by the way, let me tell you a story.
Well, he says, all those rumors, not true. One of these not many years ago, I smashed for someone who was drowning in it. Let this be mankind's picture of the truth. Well, it sounds as though what Dante is doing is apologizing for having sort of smashed church property, if you will. Well, in the sense that, people, kind of thing that would easily, if you're a popular figure and an important public figure like Dante, something that would easily make its way into whatever the Florentine version of the National Enquirer would be that week. Famous politician slash poet accused of destroying church property. And Dante is saying, no, you got the picture all wrong. What I was doing was not destroying church property. What I was doing was saving the life of this child who somehow got wedged in there. Had to kind of break a little bit of plaster or break a little bit of marble in order to get the child out. Well, the thing that's sort of interesting about this event is that most scholars, there's no way of really universally proving this because there's no way of really proving a negative, but certainly no evidence has emerged that such an event really did exist in Dante's life. This seems like something that he's making up. So he's making up a story about himself in order to deny it. Well, that's kind of interesting. What's up with that? What he's doing, of course, is suggesting that there's a kind of analogy between this story about himself and the very thing that's going on in this canto. To put it another way, here's Dante taking some hard shots at the church itself here by criticizing in the severest possible terms its corrupt leaders. Well, if you were one of those corrupt leaders, I think that your way of responding would be to accuse Dante of blasphemy, and Dante's response would be, no, what I'm doing is really taking a dead church and bringing it back to life. In other words, acting as a kind of prophet here at an institution that has mistaken the letter for the spirit, so that he's providing us with a kind of smashing the physical baptistry, the physical baptismal font becomes an analogy for what he's doing in the canto as a whole. And of course, what it means is that he's the one who is sort of the life giver. Have to keep that in mind because that kind of imagery remains throughout this very dense and interesting canto.
The way I would put it is that the purpose of this baptismal font, after all, it's a piece of machinery, in a sense, designed to set up things so that the priest can give life. This is all about life. What's happening is that piece of equipment is malfunctioning right now because this kid's stuck in this hole and presumably water is rising up in there, and therefore it's causing death. It's causing the opposite of what it's made to do. And so if you're for life, rather than for taking care of the equipment, if you're for life, you've got to break it. Because it's doing the opposite of what it was created by God to do. Yeah. And so, in some ways, what Dante is going to say is, and anybody that wants to make a proto-Protestant out of Dante's really got it wrong. That in fact, what I had to do is, in a sense, take a whack at these evil popes because they're bringing death where their purpose is to bring life. And so I am trying to get the church back functioning to the way God meant it to function. I'm doing a holy thing, not a blasphemous thing. And I think that claim he makes in this little aside here, somebody walking by the baptistry that day sort of peeks in and there's Dante with a sledgehammer. Okay? You're missing what I'm doing. You've misunderstood it. Equally, if you think I'm simply attacking the church here, are you misunderstanding what I'm doing? I'm trying to save the church.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get the church back to what it's supposed to be doing.
What looks superficially blasphemous is really deeply life-affirming in Dante's prophetic stance. By the way, I think that's a good opportunity. I want to take a minute to give a plug for a book, sort of suggestions for further readings. We had mentioned Robert Hollander as one of the new translators of Dante. Hollander is a very, very distinguished Dante scholar up the road at Princeton, longtime president of the Dante Society, person who's actually responsible for the Dante Dartmouth project, the thing that has all of the commentaries online, came out with a book about 2 or 3 years ago called Dante, A Life in Works. It's a work meant, first of all, for a kind of general reader, and secondly, what it does, and does quite effectively, is take all of Dante's other writings, that is to say, the not divine comedy stuff, and read them in relation to the comedy. So that if you want to find out how Dante's early poetry fits into the comedy, or how his treatise on monarchy fits, this is the place to go. And the reason that I wanted, that this seemed like the appropriate place to give the plug, is that I want to just quote one section from it, where he's talking about Dante's relationship to the papacy, and to use it as a kind of footnote for what Bill said about Dante as no crypto-Protestant he. He says, in short, there is not a line in anything that Dante ever wrote that exhibits the slightest doubt about the institution of the papacy, and then sort of talks about those who might have said the contrary. So, again, I recommend this one sort of highly as a place to go sort of from here. In any case, a place to go in the canto is to sort of continue looking at things from the pilgrim's point of view now. He has an analogy for what he sees, which means that he is sort of physically scoping out the territory. He's compared it to a baptistry, and he goes back and he says, there's a difference, though. The soles of every sinner's feet were flaming. Their naked legs were twitching frenziedly, which is to say, that's all he sees. Which is to say, of course, anybody who knows that Simon Magus legend knows that the souls who are there are imitating the fall of Simon the magician in their very positioning here down in the pit of hell. But he still doesn't know what this is all about. And so Virgil basically tells him, well, speak to these legs, right? Well, you don't know. All right, but what's going to happen here? And moving over to line 47, whatever you are, holding your upside down, O wretched soul, stuck like a stake in ground, make a sound or something, I said, if you can. I stood there like a priest who is confessing some vile assassin who, fixed in his ditch, has called him back again to put off dying. That's another very interesting image there. What it refers to is an actual penalty imposed in Florence for people who were found guilty of plotting against the life of a Florentine citizen, people who came in from the outside sort of as a hired gun. Okay, so that if somebody comes over from Jersey into Philly here to bump somebody off, he's caught. The punishment is that they were buried upside down alive. And that not being the most pleasant way to die, presumably what they would do would be to sort of postpone their, can I make a last confession? Yes, you're upside down, waiting for the pour of the dirt. What? One more sin I just thought of, something I did when I was 7 years old. Okay, this is what Dante says. Like a priest who is confessing some vile assassin who, fixed in his ditch, has called him back again to put off dying. Well, notice the positioning. In this canto, positioning is all. Because Dante is in the position of a priest, the upside-down soul is in the position of an assassin. Well, it turns out, of course, that the person who's in the position of an assassin is, or was, a pope. So Dante, the layman, is hearing the confession of not only a priest, but the high priest of Christendom. Dante, sort of leaping into the breach that has somehow been is present because of the corruption of the church, takes on a kind of sacramental function, and the Pope who is there is quite literally an assassin in the sense that he is killing the church. And as it turns out, notice that we had a reference to baptism. Now we have a very interesting reference to the sacrament of penance, to confession, because they have a little interchange, and this guy, who turns out to be Pope Nicholas III goes to confession to Dante in the sense that he tells him all of the bad things that he did as Pope. But of course, it's not a real confession. It's a kind of parody of one, because it's not a confession based on sorrow or repentance, and it doesn't bring about anything like the absolution of Dante.
Is that you here already upright? Is that you here already upright, Boniface? By many years the book has lied to me. Are you fed up so soon with all that wealth for which you did not fear to take by guile the lovely lady, then tear her asunder? Okay. Those are the words that Dante hears coming from somewhere underneath these legs. Legs, by the way, I just want to point out parenthetically, have the fire on the soles of the feet. Okay. Pentecost, on the head. Here, on the feet. Another reference to a sacrament. Another reference, of course, to the birthday of the church. Another reference to Acts of the Apostles. So this is the question, hey Boniface, what are you doing up there? Remember who we're talking to now. And of course, Dante's standing there saying, what in the hell's going on? What kind of nonsense is this? It's like walking up to Ron and saying, excuse me, aren't you Clark Gable? It's such an absurd question. Sorry, because he's dead. Not because of look, because he's dead. It's such an absurd question, you don't answer it right away. I mean, the answer's simple. The answer is no. But you don't do that. You sort of say, it can't mean that. So Dante's sort of speechless because it's such a wacky question. The question is, aren't you Boniface VIII? Well, no. I'm not anything like Boniface VIII in so many ways. But that's the question Dante's being asked. Virgil has to say to Dante, just say no. Okay, just say, no, I'm not Boniface. So Virgil sort of coaches him, and finally Dante sort of gets that out. Well then, what do you want of me? If it concerns you so to learn my name, that for this reason you came down the bank, know that I once wore the great mantle. Code, I was Pope. But actually, I was the she-bear's son. Okay, this is a situation where it works better in Italian than in translation, because Pope Nicholas III has just identified himself because he's a member of the Orsini family. And Orsini means little bears. Okay, so he's identified himself by giving his family name. And what he says is, I wore the great mantle, but really I was an Orsini. Now, we know how this works. When a pope is chosen, a pope chooses a new name because he has a new identity. We don't talk about Karel Wojtyła anymore. We talk about Pope John Paul II. He chose a new name. He's become something new. He has taken on this new mission as the high priest of the church. What Nicholas is saying here is, I took on a new name, but I remained an Orsini. Meaning I'm thinking like an Orsini, I'm acting like an Orsini, and I'm taking care of the Orsini, because that's what an Orsini member does. And so, even just in saying, I wore the great mantle, but actually I was a she-bear's son, that is a confession whether he knows it or not.
Notice that it's also parallel to what we said before about the kind of factionalism in politics, when people take family, ancestry, and self to be the only determinants. In other words, no sense of looking out for the common good. How much more so doing the same thing on the spiritual front? I was Pope, that title, but that didn't really count. What really counted was what I could do for my own family. And of course, that's exactly what his simony consisted in, that nepotism and greed are so closely allied here. And so what he's doing is essentially confessing the nature of his sin, but again, more by way of boasting than by way of being sorry for it. So what it lacks are the things that would make the confession sacramental. He goes on to say, beneath my head are pushed down all the others who came sinning in simony before me. Because what you have is that principle of apostolic succession where only one pope at a time can be occupying the chair. Now you have only one in the upside-down chair. Notice the pun works here, the cathedra Petri, Peter being rock, okay? They're upside down in the rock, submerged there, one at a time, till somebody else is going to come and push him farther in. So, before me, squeezed rightly in the fissures of the rock, I, in my turn, shall join the rest below as soon as he comes, the one I thought you were, which is to say Boniface VIII. And here, Dante does just a wonderful bit of wizardry. Remember, we talked before about the difference in the time frame. Dante writing this sometime after 1308, but before his death in 1321, but the fictional date of the pilgrimage is 1300. In the year 1300, okay, the only people who can be placed in hell, again, when I ask the magic question to my students, what do you have to do to be in hell? First thing is, you got to be dead, all right? Second thing is, you got to be dead by 1300. Okay, so, for example, in 1298, a character named Guido de Montefeltro dies, and he's in hell. But there are people who died in, very, very ancient times, and they're in hell as well. Well, what happens to old Boniface VIII, this terrible simoniac, and, by the way, the person who is most responsible for Dante's own exile, and, by the way, the person who's taking his ill-gotten money and using it to wage war on his fellow Christians? By virtue of the fiction of the poem, he can't really be here, but his place is predicted in advance. And as if, Dante wants to sort of say, I have nothing to do with it, he's actually, his place there is predicted by his predecessor, as if to say, yeah, I'm a kind of big league simoniac, but compared to Boniface, I'm still playing the AAA circuit. Okay? You want to know about real simony, there's this guy coming along. And of course, Dante's there saying, I don't know what's happening here. So Dante is able to sort of get this wonderful, wonderful dig in at Boniface at the same time that he's going to sort of have what we call nowadays deniability. And it works really quite brilliantly. And in a moment which, in terms of its import and its consequences, is hugely tragic in terms of what's going on in Dante's own lifetime, it's a great moment of comic inventiveness on the part of the poet.
In fact, Dante actually says, and there's another poet that's going to come after Boniface, again, from this difference between when he writes the poem and when the poem is set. And that's Clement V. And the reason I think Dante wants to put Clement V here is Clement V is the one responsible for moving the papacy to Avignon, the beginning of what we call the Babylonian captivity that took place in 1305. After a very, very brief pontificate, Clement V was elected as pope and never got to Rome and stayed in territory that was controlled, or at least under the watchful eye of the French. And then Dante tells us about himself, that is, say, the character Dante. I do not know. Perhaps I was too bold here, but I answered him in tune with his own words. Well, tell me now, what was the sum of money that Holy Peter had to pay our Lord before he gave the keys into his keeping? Certainly he asked no more than, follow me. Nor did Peter, nor did the rest extort gold coins or silver from Matthias when he was picked to fill the place the evil one had lost. So stay stuck there, for you are rightly punished.
Well, first of all, you'll notice that there is a very strong invective at the very beginning of the canto, but as Bill rightly pointed out, that was the invective of the poet rather than the pilgrim. The poet sort of saying, hey, all you knuckleheads out there, this is going to be a really important one. Listen, pay attention. I got a biggie coming along. Because the pilgrim hasn't even figured out the physical geography, let alone the spiritual geography at hell. When he does figure it out, he reacts violently and intensely to the blasphemy that is involved in all of this simony. Which is to say, this is pretty much the first time, or at least the most emphatic time up until now, where the pilgrim gets it. Up until then, he had been sympathizing with the sinners, sort of in a way vicariously participating in their sin. But now, what he's doing is distancing himself from it, and this invective grows stronger and stronger as he realizes what the consequences of all of this turn out to be. So he says over on 106, you shepherds it was the evangelist had in mind when the vision came to him of her who sits upon the waters playing whore with kings. That is to say, of course, he's going to the Apocalypse, to Revelation 17:12, talking about the whore of Babylon, and basically saying that what you have in terms of this corruption in the present day is so bad, so serious, that the only language that we can use that's appropriate to it is the language that we associate with the evil of the end times. In other words, Dante is not only becoming a prophet here, but a sort of apocalyptic prophet at that, pointing out just how desperate the situation is for the church in his own time.
I want to just for a second flash forward. We want to come back, but I want to flash forward because Ron made the very important point that this really seems to be a turning point in the progress of Dante the Pilgrim, from somebody who gets in an argument with Farinata on his own terms or swoons in sympathy with Francesca, to identify with God's punishment rather than with the sinner, which is what he's been doing. But it is important to say, in the very next canto, he screws up again. He sees the fortune tellers, and their heads are on backwards. Okay, it's a very good thing for fortune tellers in hell. And their tears are running down their backs and through the cleft of their buttocks. And Dante starts to cry. And Virgil chastises, to weep here is wrong. You are confusing things here, because here, this does not deserve pity. They've made their choices. This is God's judgment on them. When you pity them, you're questioning God. And so you've slipped, you've fallen, you've taken a step backwards. And that's a very important lesson that Dante the poet wants to give us. That, we want to keep hitting these plateaus and go forever onward and ever onward. That the great moral change that Dante's undergoing doesn't ever go that smoothly. You start out wrong, you make some progress, you screw up, you slip back, and whatever. We know what the general pattern is here. Dante starts out dumb and ends up smart. But it's not that, day by day in every way I'm getting better and better. It's not that kind of pap that about a century ago, I think, when that became popular. It's not that kind of pap. It's the real thing that Dante's telling us. And he's telling us both to warn us and to comfort us, I think, about despair. So here, Dante really gets it right. And, just next ditch, gets it wrong.
I would argue that, again, as we said at the very beginning, and positing the Exodus as one of the models for Dante's journey, that this is very much like the wandering in the desert with all of the backsliding that takes place there. That, they say something right, and then all of a sudden there they are longing for those good old days when they could be by the flesh pots of Egypt. They have very short memories, and Dante, in imitation of this, kind of enacting his own Exodus, goes around in circles as much as he goes forward. So that it's interesting to see that pattern as well. Notice that the language continues, you who have, and it's so interesting to see the way it's scripturally based. We have Revelation there of the Apocalypse when he's talking about the whore of Babylon, and he continues that imagery through two whole tercets. Then he says, you have built yourself a god of gold and silver. How do you differ from the idolater except he worships one? You worship hundreds. The equation between avarice and idolatry is made pretty explicit in Ephesians. And Dante is somebody who knows his Paul pretty well too. Surprise, surprise. And then he continues with a most interesting apostrophe. You notice that at the very beginning, the person who was singled out was, O Simon Magus. Now notice what happens. Except, of course, it's the pilgrim speaking rather than the poet. O Constantine, what evil did you sire, not by your conversion, but by the dower that the first wealthy father got from you? Well, a very, very interesting thing here when Dante is taking the spiritual condition of the papacy in his own time all the way back to the time of Constantine. What's up with that?
By the way, that's 1,000 years back. We need to remember, Dante's looking at a long time ago. We're closer to Dante in time than Dante was to Constantine. We need to remember we're talking about very long periods of time here. And Dante looks back and says, well, good thing Constantine converted to Christianity. But he gave the church wealth and political power when he moved over to Constantinople. He gave them the Lateran Palace. He gave them, at least according to the legend, it turns out it is a legend, of the donation of Constantine. He gave them political power. Boy, did Constantine screw up. And by the way, Dante reiterates this in very passionate terms at the end of Purgatory, when he sort of retells symbolically church history. And he once again condemns all this that Constantine gave to the church. And yet, Constantine's in heaven. Dante meets Constantine pretty high up in heaven, as it turns out. And so what we learn here is Constantine did things that had awful consequences. Constantine did them for good reasons. He sincerely believed and honestly believed and rationally believed, I suppose, that he was doing a good thing. The Pope needs a place to live. They need a place to build a church that'll hold the people now that the church is now triumphant or becoming triumphant in Rome. I'm going to leave to go to Constantinople. Who do I want to put in charge? How about somebody good? How about somebody nice? How about somebody just? How about somebody fair? How about the Pope? How about the Bishop of Rome? And so what we learn is, although obviously it's important not to make mistakes, it's important that we consider intention, not just result. And therefore, Constantine, who's sort of criticized here and excoriated in some way symbolically at the end of Purgatory, we also meet up in the heaven itself.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting to see that what Dante is getting at, I mean, what's he saying? Well, what's he blaming Constantine exactly for? For setting this trend, which continues up to his own day, where the popes are used to messing around with temporal power big time. From Dante's point of view, the fact that the popes and the emperors are engaged in this kind of knockdown, drag-out struggle over who is going to have temporal supremacy in Europe is a huge, huge perversion. And basically what Dante is doing is saying that the problem with all of this gold and silver stuff, we'll find out in a later canto, is that it enables Boniface, or somebody like Boniface, to be able to sort of pay the armies that are fighting fellow Christians for control, for supremacy in Europe. And clearly what he's saying here is that what popes ought to be concerned about is the spiritual realm. It is their preoccupation with the material that prevents them from doing so. So that this is very wide-reaching, not only in terms of the condemnation of abuses as such, but of a system which has enabled those abuses to take place.
I want to go back to an earlier section of the same speech that Dante the Pilgrim is giving. And were it not for the reverence I have for those highest of all keys that you once held in the happy life, if this did not restrain me, I would use even harsher words than these. In other words, Dante is again making a distinction between office and person. I don't want to offer any disrespect to the office. I'm not criticizing the office. He believes in the office. I'm criticizing the holder of the office, and I need to make that distinction. But then he said, for your avarice brings grief upon the world, crushing the good, exalting the depraved. This is exactly what Ron's talking about in sort of trickle-down immorality. Okay, here's the problem. If you are out to make money and secure the riches for the family, the Orsini family, who are your bishops going to be? Well, there are a couple answers. One is Orsini. Okay, they make nice bishops. And the other answer is people who will give me some money for the job so that I can hand it on to the Orsini. Well, okay, now you got the wrong guys as bishops, right? Because the good guys either don't have the money, or even if they had it, they wouldn't pay it. Right? So there's the problem. Now, here we are in a local diocese. How's your parish priest going to conduct himself? Well, I know how the bishop conducts himself. I know how the bishop gets ahead. I know how the pope gets ahead. How am I going to get ahead? There are ways I can make money at this job too. Gee, I didn't know that's what it was about, but I guess it is, because all the big guys do it that way. We've seen this, I think, in politics in our country. We've seen it in other ways as well, that leadership matters. We would probably say today, role models matter. Leadership matters. And what happens is, whatever the big guys do, the small guys are going to do. The wrong guys are going to be in offices in the first place, and they're going to be on the take because, A, they had to be on the take to get their office, they got to get their money back, they had to pay for it, and B, they've got these models of how clergy operate. It's good enough for the bishop, it's good enough for, St. Charles Parish or whatever it might be. And so here what we see is how this is not just a problem in Rome. It's a problem in every diocese, it's a problem in every parish, it's a problem in every monastery and convent in Europe. But it starts with bad leadership, a point again that Dante drives home explicitly in the very middle cantos, cantos 50 and 51, that is to say, the middle cantos of the middle part of the Divine Comedy, Purgatory.
There's some of you may know the historian of religion, Houston Smith. One of his comparative statements about the difference between Western and Eastern religions is that in Western religions pay much more attention to matter. And he says if you want some evidence of that, take a look at the way in which you become a Jew. You've got to cut off a piece of your penis, for crying out loud. You can't get any more material than that. Well, in a way, that's continued in the Catholic Christian notion of a sacrament as an outward and physical sign of an inward and spiritual grace. Notice that the whole movement of this canto is for Dante the Pilgrim to start with outward and physical description and gradually come to learn the spirit of what's behind it, the meaning of it all, even as the popes have gone the other way around. Okay, that the movement of the Simoniacs is to go in the opposite direction, being entrusted with the spiritual life of the church. They move more and more in the direction of the material. And since this is so embedded in the sacramental idea that were, in sort of sacramental definitions that were being promulgated at this time, it's not surprising that there is so much imagery here that relates to the church's sacraments. You recall that this is also around the time when it was definitively given that there are 7 of them. I ask you to try this sort of thought experiment on your own time, since we're quickly running out of hours. But my guess is that, it's actually not a guess, I've actually done this. If you go through, you can find references to all 7 sacraments that are being turned upside down. We've certainly seen it in terms of penance. We've seen it in terms of baptism. We've seen it in terms of unction and anointing, because the feet of the people are presented as being anointed. Notice the language of matrimony that's presented both at the beginning and at the end. The whore of Babylon, but also at the very beginning, it says, those things of God that should rightly be wed to holiness, you rapacious creatures, for the price of gold and silver prostitute. And so there's this wonderful sense in which Dante is looking at this in terms of the larger sacramental structure of the church and saying that the very channels of grace are being perverted by the activity of these Simoniac popes.
Probably time for our final round of questions and comments, because the hour draws short, and presumably, like us, you have other things to do, or we have a flight to catch in not too long a time. Let's find out what other questions and comments you might have about this canto, or about anything really that we've said all day. Make this sort of a wrap-up session.
He seems to condemn quite strongly the leadership